Citlali's early access is here, so it's time to take a look into her kit and analyze how good she should be, what teams she will use, and how to build and invest into her. Note that some of the teams discussed here were also mentioned in my mavuika video, so there may be some repeated information. But with that said, let's get started. So, you probably know the gist of Citlali's kit by now, but I'll summarize just so that we are all on the same page. Citlali is a 5-star Cryo Catalyst unit that provides a shield with her skill, which lasts 20 seconds and scales off her Elemental Mastery, although the shield's HP seems to be pretty low. She can gain Night Soul points via casting her skill as well as Burst, as well as when party members trigger Melt, Frozen, or Night Soul Burst. Once Citlali gains enough Night Soul points, her skill will start gradually consuming her Night Soul to deal cryo damage in a large AoE, which seems to apply cryo once every 2 seconds, and it appears that this should last about 12 seconds, so roughly the same application and duration as Rosaria. She'll also provide 20% resistance shred to both Pyro and Hydro when a party member triggers either Melt or Frozen. So between this resistance shred, the cryo application, being able to use Scroll, providing a shield, and even being able to use support weapons like Thrilling Tales or her own signature weapon, Citlali has a lot of utility in her kit, which should make her a valuable asset for several teams. Specifically, it seems that Citlali will primarily be useful for pyro damage dealers, since her cryo application can help them melt, although her own cryo application alone is likely not enough, so for consistent forward melts, you'll likely want to be playing double cryo, using Citlali alongside somebody like Kaya or Rosaria. One unit that should benefit very well from this is Olicino, with a team of Citlali, Rosaria, Bennett. Here, Olicino misses out on using buffs such as Kazuha or Shilonin, as well as buffs from Farina or Yelan that she would have in a Vaporized team, but between Citlali's own buffing, plus Cryo Resonance, Rosaria's buff, and the much higher multiplier from Melt, Olicino's damage here looks to be around the same as her Vaporized teams. And since she'll be protected by Citlali's shield, you likely won't need to cast Olicino's Burst very often to heal, which will result in doing a shorter rotation, thus making this her new highest DPS team. Though in Abyss lineups where grouping is important, going back to VV Vape teams to use Kazuha will probably be ideal. Also, having a shield on Olicino itself can just be very valuable since she can't heal. Yoimiya should also be able to use double cryo with Citlali very well, using that same setup of Citlali, Rosaria, and Bennett. This seems like it will be around the same power level as Yoimiya's current strongest team, and this one has a shield, which for Yoimiya in particular, this is of great value since she has very little poise when doing her normal attacks, so this should be her undisputed best team. She won't be doing more damage than what she's already capable of, but you will have a much easier time doing it. Jamal should also be able to use this same team core. We have already seen Jamal successfully melt all of his damage in double cryo teams with existing cryo options, so this one should definitely work as well. Based on the numbers, it looks like this will be his new strongest team. His personal damage will be a bit lower than in his vaporized teams with Farina and Jian Yun, but the rotation is shorter, so it has more DPS. Furthermore, Xianyun's buff in the Vaporized team only applies to one target, which is a downside you won't have in this team, and that downside is very noticeable in the Vaporized team, since Jamal does have a huge AoE. Having a lot of buffing missing on that AoE damage is a pretty big downside, and you're not going to have that here. And while Jamal doesn't need a shield, having one is still a nice added bonus. And then mavuika is also looking to have really good synergy with Citlali, though I don't think double cryo will be the way to go. Instead, a team of mavuika, Shilonen, Citlali, Bennett. Citlali's solo cryo application more than likely won't be enough to consistently melt on mavuika with her charged attacks while she's on field, but it should definitely be enough to allow mavuika to melt her burst. Mavuika's burst is capable of dealing nearly 1 million damage when melted, if not more, even at Constellation 0. That alone is more than enough melting. And Mavuika benefits tremendously from supports that have Night Soul, so Citlali will be contributing that as well. It's very likely this is going to be Mavuika's strongest team. Another Pyro DPS that should benefit very well from Citlali is Linny. He applies far too much Pyro to melt his own damage, even with double Cryo, but he can use Citlali in a triple Pyro team, utilizing the huge damage buff he gives himself against enemies with a Pyro aura, since Citlali will not be removing the Pyro aura. Ideally, this should be Linny, Bennett, mavuika, Citlali. As mentioned, mavuika's bar deals massive front-loaded damage when melted, and she should melt it with the right rotation here, resulting in her doing incredible sub-DPS damage, and all of that damage is AoE, so it's making up for one of Linny's weaknesses, which is AoE. And since Citlali's Night Soul consumption will charge mavuika's Fighting Spirit, mavuika will be providing a somewhat decent-sized damage bonus buff to Linny as well. With the rotations listed here, Linny only performs 3 charged shots, and the third one is assumed to not be Bennett buffed. Yet, this still seems to be his new strongest team, and that's Well Shielded, which, much like Yoimiya, is very valuable for Linny since he's a ranged unit. And the last melt team I think Citlali will be great with is Chaska. One of Chaska's current downsides is that she has no good means of resistant shred, since she doesn't work well with Kazuha nor Shilonin. Citlali solves this issue. Like Linny, Chaska should work great with a team core of Citlali, Bennett, mavuika. While this isn't Chaska's highest personal damage team, mavuika just deals such an absurd amount of damage when her burst melts that it's still just worth the trade-off. Plus, like mentioned with Linny, mavuika's damage is AoE, so she's making up for that weakness of Chaska's as well. So this should definitely be Chaska's new best team. And those are all of the melt teams in Pyro DPS I think Citlali will work well with. Characters I didn't mention such as Hu Tao are because I don't see any way for Citlali to work well with them. Hu Tao applies too much Pyro to melt. Even if you are using a C6 Kaya, who is the fastest Cryo applier in the game, with a second Cryo unit, it's still not enough for Hu Tao, so there's no way Citlali will suddenly be enough. The Luke also shouldn't work well with Citlali, as he would need to replace both Farina and Bennett to run double Cryo on his Plunge team, and that's not going to be worth it. He might be able to do a VV Melt team like Kazuha, Bennett, and Citlali, similar to his original Melt team with Kaya, but there's no way that's going to be anywhere near as good as his Plunge team. I have also seen people talk about using Citlali alongside a Hydro sub DPS like Farina or Yelan to enable freeze melt teams for Pyro DPS, but you shouldn't do that. If you apply freeze to an enemy that can't be frozen, such as a boss, you'll be left with neither Hydro nor Cryo Aura, thus you'll lose both Vaporize and Melt, getting neither, so that's just not worth it. But, moving on from Pyro, Citlali is also intended to work well with Hydro DPS and Freeze teams. This is a bit awkward, because Freeze teams are usually Cryo DPS, not Hydro. The only Hydro DPS that this makes any sense for is Nuvolette. The team for this would be Nuvolette, Farina, Citlali, Kazuha. And this seems to be the new best way to play Nuvolette with a shield, as Citlali will provide the same amount of resistance shred as Zhongli, and she provides a bit more damage bonus with Scroll than he does with Petra, and Scroll has a much better uptime and is much easier to use than Petra. However, while this is Nuvolette's strongest shielded team, it's not his strongest team, as teams such as Nuvolette, Farina, Kazuha with Shilin and Auroron as the fourth slot, as well as his forward Vaporized teams, are all stronger. Still, for a C0 Nuvolette, having the shield plus freeze for comfort may make the Citlali team better in practice for you. I have also seen people discuss possibly using Citlali with Mualani in a team of Mualani, Citlali, mavuika, Shilonin. The idea here is that you'll apply Cryo and melt Mavuika's burst, then swap to Mualani and have Pyro applied for mavuika. And since Cryo doesn't fully remove a Pyro aura, Citlali should not interfere with Mualani vaporizing. However, there's a huge flaw with this. After Mualani vaporizes and removes the Pyro aura, it is very possible Citlali is going to apply Cryo again before mavuika reapplies Pyro. And if that happens, you'll now be triggering Freeze on Mualani instead of Vaporize, which obviously you don't want to be doing that. As such, this team will definitely need to be tested for consistency in post-release, but even if it does work, it doesn't seem to be better than other options like Mona or Chiori for Mualani. unless you have a constellated Citlali. And now one last team I looked into Citlali with is being a shielder for Wanderer. The idea is that Citlali is Cryo and Catalyst, so she should allow Wanderer to get his crit rate buff, while she will also be buffing him with Thrilling Tales or her signature weapon. And unfortunately, this seems to actually be inferior to Layla. The problem is, to get Thrilling Tales buff on Wanderer here, you'll need to cast both Citlali's skill and the burst after Bennett, which, depending on Citlali's exact field time requirements, will likely cause Wanderer to miss Bennett buff on his burst at the end of his rotation, unless you cut his field time a bit short. If using Citlali's signature weapon, you can use her before Bennett, and thus not have to cut Wanderer's time short, but even then, it's only slightly better than Layla. And with that said, Layla does need C6 to be truly consistent with Wanderer, so Citlali is another option if you don't have a C6 Layla, but just know that Citlali will not be an upgrade over existing options for Wanderer, even if you're only looking at using him with a shield. Layla's shield is also much, much tankier than Citlali's, so Layla is superior both offensively and defensively. And those are all the teams Citlali currently seems to be worthwhile for. You may be wondering what about using her with a Cryo DPS, but this doesn't seem like a good idea. Citlali's Cryo application runs the risk of stealing melts from your actual Cryo DPS, and Citlali does not provide resistant shred to Cryo, so she does far less for them than she does for Pyro. But with that said, let's now look into how to build Citlali. Starting with her artifacts, if there's no one else on this set, you'll pretty much always be having her on the scroll set. And if there is somebody else on the set, or if she can't trigger the set effect on a team, the Tenacity of the Millilith set is also great for her, as Citlali can consistently trigger it. And on top of the attack buff it provides, it also makes her shield stronger. There may also be some teams and rotations where it's worth using Citlali on instructors, but these are pretty much the only sets you'll ever be using Citlali on, as her personal damage is not important, so you just want to maximize her buffing however best you can. And for Citlali's main stats, most of the time you'll have her on ER, EM, EM. If you don't need an ER stance to hit your energy requirements, then use an EM stance instead. If you're using Favonius Codex, you'll want a crit rate circlet for consistency. Substats will be the same thing, just focus on EM and ER until you have enough to burst every rotation. And for her energy requirements, it depends heavily on the exact team, but as solo Cryo, you can expect her to need up to 210%. It's definitely worth bursting every rotation on Citlali, as it will likely take too long to build up Night Soul points on her without it, and she's a support, so there's not much lost by building high ER anyway. As for weapons, Citlali's signature is always going to be her best weapon, as it provides a good-sized buff to your active character, while giving Citlali a whopping 365 elemental mastery, making her shield much stronger. If you don't have it, Thrilling Tail should be used instead for most teams. You'll just need to make sure you rotate properly for it. If Thrilling Tales doesn't work in your team or rotation, Wandering Evenstar can also provide a buff, though it's much smaller. Favonius Codex can also be good for easily hitting your energy requirements and supporting the rest of the team with theirs. Sacrificial Fragments is a unique option because Citlali makes 4 particles on cast of her skill, so she'll be producing 8 front-loaded particles with it, and she'll gain 24 Night Soul on both casts, so the second cast of her skill might be able to replace her burst in some rotations, and it also has EM on the main stat for that shield. Fruit of Fulfillment is also a nice option, as it will give a good amount of both energy recharge and elemental mastery. Lastly, let's look into Citlali's Constellations. I won't be looking at how these increase Citlali's personal damage, since her own damage is mostly a non-factor in her teams. Instead, I'll show how they increase the damage of the main DPS. For this, I've chosen to use Olicino with the double Cryo team. Citlali C1 gives her additional buffing via a base damage buff equal to double her elemental mastery, and she'll typically get 16 instances of this per rotation. This looks to be around a 13% increase in damage for the main DPS, which is excellent for a buffing constellation on a support C1, considering most don't even get a buff until C2. And for Citlali C2, it seems pretty insane. It will give herself an extra 125 elemental mastery, thus making both the shield and her C1 buff stronger, and it will also provide your on-fielder an additional 250 elemental mastery. Assuming your on-fielder is utilizing EM, this should be around an 18% increase from C1 and a cumulative increase from C0 of 32%, which is phenomenal for support constellations. At this point, Citlali just straight up provides some of the most buffing in the entire game. And her C3 to 5 don't improve her as a support much, so there's nothing much to see there, though her C4 could make her a much stronger sub DPS, but her C6 is where more buffs lie. This constellation basically provides 60 damage bonus to both Pyro and Hydro. You can expect this to be about an 18% increase over C2 and a 57% total increase from C0. And that's pretty strong, but at C2, Citlali, she already provides far more than enough buffing. At that point, you more than likely will be just better off pulling constellations on your DPS instead if you want to vertically invest farther. And that covers just about everything. To recap, Citlali is looking to be a top tier support for some Pyro DPS, being a good upgrade for several such as Chaska, Arlecchino, Linny, and more, while giving them the comfort of a shield, although her shield is pretty weak, looking to be around the strength of shields like Xinyan and Diona's, which is far lower than shields like Layla and Zhongli, so just keep that in mind, as you'll likely still need to be doing some dodging even with Citlali, depending on the enemies you're facing. Citlali is also looking to be one of the best supports to pair with mavuika, since mavuika benefits tremendously from natlan supports to fuel her fighting spirit, so it's likely the two of them will be a great duo to use in future teams as well. And if you liked today's video, please be sure to give a like and subscribe and comment down below. Also feel free to join my Discord, link in the pinned comment. Thanks and goodbye.